Thanks very much for staying with us. Time now for Eye on Africa with me, Georgia Calvin-Smith. Tonight, France denies UN findings that an airstrike by the French military in central Mali killed 19 civilians. Also, the Terminator's appeal comes to an abrupt end. Judges at the ICC uphold convictions and sentencing of the ominously nicknamed Congolese warlord Bosco Ntaganda, who was found guilty in 2019 of war crimes. And coffee production relies on a stable environment, and climate change is taking its toll on growers in Kenya. Communities relying on the crop there are increasingly worried about their futures. But first, France has denied UN findings that an airstrike by the French military in central Mali killed 19 civilians. The United Nations report appears to confirm accounts from residents in a village called Bounti, who said that several people had been killed in a strike targeting a wedding party on January the 3rd. Now, France has denied that there was a wedding, says it did not do anything wrong, and insists that it only struck jihadists. Mali has backed up France's claim.
One airstrike, two competing narratives. Just what happened on January 3rd at Bounti in the Douentza region of Mali. What's not in dispute is that on that day, a French airstrike killed over 20 people near the small village in the country's remote central desert. The French army says it targeted a group of armed Islamist militants. But an investigation conducted by MINUSMA, the UN's mission in Mali, reached a different conclusion.
MINUSMA is able to confirm that a wedding celebration was held that brought together about 100 civilians at the site of the strike. There were 5 armed individuals among them, presumed members of Katiba Serma.
Katiba Serma is a jihadi group, part of an alliance affiliated with al-Qaeda. According to the report, just 3 of its members present that day were killed in the strike. The UN says the majority of the crowd on hand that day, civilians, should have been protected under international humanitarian law. France continues to deny any error, insisting that the strike killed several dozen armed jihadists that it identified through what it calls robust targeting. The French Defense Ministry has singled out the UN investigation's methodology, saying it relies on unverifiable and contradictory local testimony.
French ministry is definitely considering that all the process for the rule of engagement has been respected in terms of humanitarian law.
The UN and humanitarian NGOs are now calling for 2 more independent investigations, one by the French themselves and one by the Malian military.
Well, earlier I asked Professor Douglas Yates, a specialist in African affairs, for his take on why France launched the airstrike in the first place.
People are talking about a wedding, but it wasn't an actual wedding. It was rather a gathering of men to celebrate a wedding. There were no women present. The drones had followed 2 men on motorcycles who are identified as extremists, and these 2 men appeared at this group of large men in a field with no women present, no sign of a wedding, and they fired. Now, it's probably a messy truth, but there were good reasons to believe that this was a gathering of terrorists.
And how sensitive an issue is this? So we've got on one hand the UN's report, France is denying the UN's report, and then of course we've got the whole wide context of the sensitivity of the battle against kind of jihadist activity within the Sahel. Where does this sit in all this?
Well, the optics are very bad. In Africa, those who are critical of France's mission in Mali will see in this another example of the heavy hand of neocolonial imperialism. But those in Europe and those in the North who are conducting military missions elsewhere are also suspicious that some kind of bavure, some kind of accident may have occurred. No one seems to be willing to stand up for France, but I doubt the UN will do anything more, because the reality is France is the one, well, protecting that southern flank of Europe.
Well, in other news, the International Criminal Court and its judges have upheld the 30-year prison sentence handed down to a Congolese warlord known as the Terminator. Bosco Ntaganda had appealed against the war crimes and crimes against humanity, of which he was convicted in 2019. The former rebel commander was found guilty of atrocities committed between 2002 and 3. Fernand Van Tetz has the latest from The Hague.
A big day for the International Criminal Court today. That famous ruling, 30-year sentence against Bosco Ntaganda, held up in the appeals chamber today. Now, Bosco Ntaganda was convicted in 2019 for 18 counts of war crimes and crimes against humanity, for crimes such as rape, murder, sexual enslavement, the use of child soldiers, and the forced displacement of populations. His militia, which was made primarily from the Hema group, targeted ruthlessly the Lendu group. And they would surround a village, then indiscriminately shell it, and then enter the village and pillage and rape and burn down houses as well. So that conviction now upheld. That was a landmark conviction because it was the first time that someone has been convicted for sexual slavery of their own troops, and it's also the longest sentence that the court has ever handed down. Now, Ntaganda today tried to get that overturned. He'd appealed 15 grounds of appeal for his judgment. Those primarily focused on whether he knew whether there was child soldiers being used, whether he knew that there was sexual slavery, and the court ruled that yes, he did. He also appealed on the grounds of whether he was a co-perpetrator, so whether he was present when the crimes were committed, and the court also dismissed that ground of appeal. They said yes, because this because of this action against the Lendu group was part of a common plan agreed with co-perpetrators. That meant that he was responsible and that ground for appeal could also be dismissed. Now, he also appealed the sentencing on 12 grounds. The majority of those grounds centered on mitigating factors that he felt should be taken into account. Those are things like his behavior in prison, but also his traumatic childhood when he was part of the Rwandan genocide. Now, the court said they had weighed all those measures, but for example, his good behavior in jail, they said when you looked at the gravity of the crimes he committed in the past few years, that was just not to be taken into consideration.
Fernand Van Tetz there for us. Now, the death toll from a stampede in Tanzania last week has risen to 45. The victims died as tens of thousands turned out in Dar es Salaam on March 21st to pay their respects to the late President John Magufuli 4 days after his death. Now, authorities say that he died of a heart condition. The opposition still claims it was coronavirus. On Tuesday, Tanzania's new president, Samia Suluhu Hassan, picked the country's finance minister, Philip Mpango, as VP. And Gabonese protesters are growing increasingly frustrated by the economic pressures caused by coronavirus and the restrictions brought in during the pandemic. Demonstrations against the measures have turned violent over the last couple of months.
Employees cry out in despair in front of a hotel in Libreville. They have been on technical unemployment for a year. Beatrice is one out of thousands of Gabonese who no longer receive social protection because of the economic crisis.
On nous payait chaque fin du mois. Ils ont tout coupé. Plus de salaire. Nous n'avons plus rien. Nous n'avons plus rien à manger. Là où j'étais logé, on m'a chassé.
For several weeks, people in Gabon have been living under one of the continent's strictest lockdowns. Measures to tame the surge of the second wave, such as curfews and business closures, have paralyzed the country's economy, giving room for growing protests.
Ils sont en train de partir là pour la prison centrale de Libreville.
This activist filmed young Gabonese who opposed health restrictions going to prison. Their movement had brought together thousands of people banging pots and pans to protest pandemic health measures. At least 2 persons were killed when clashes erupted between police and protesters.
On va cogner sur des casseroles. Ils ont été envoyés en prison pour incitation à la révolte et atteinte à la sûreté de l'État. Je pense que c'est réduire vraiment à zéro l'image de notre système judiciaire.
Members of this human rights NGO have decided to meet the judiciary head-on. They gather in their headquarters to decide how to help the protesters detained without trial.
Rien ne justifie leur incarcération, leur présence à la prison centrale. Nous avons les pôles d'avocats, des avocats qui sont constitués automatiquement quand il y a des arrestations arbitraires. Et pour le moment, nous sommes en train d'engager des démarches déjà pour libérer ces jeunes.
Authorities in Gabon did not want to comment on the situation in the country. The protesters may not be scheduled for trial in the next 3 months. While waiting, Gabonese hope the government implements new social protection measures.
Well, coffee production relies on stable environmental conditions, and climate change is taking its toll on growers in Kenya. Unpredictable rain patterns and drought have led to a steep drop-off in their earnings, and many communities that rely on the crop are becoming increasingly worried about their futures.
Kenya is Africa's 5th largest producer of Arabica coffee. Plantations here cover 110,000 hectares of land. But according to the country's Coffee Research Institute, climate change is having a deep impact on the sector.
In Kenya, we produce Arabica coffee, which prefers cool and wet conditions. Because of increase of temperature caused by climate change and depressed rains, then we have poorer quality of the yields and poorer amounts of the yields.
Erratic rainfall has complicated the lives of farmers.
Now with the climate change, we have unpredictable rain patterns, whereby in terms of crop production, we are not able to predict when to apply the fertilizers or farm inputs in general, and that one, it affects coffee production.
The irregular rainfall means there are showers during dry periods, so some bushes flower too early.
Sasa kwa hii sasa mumea unapata hii iko tayari kuvunwa, hii red ones na hii green ones bado sasa inachukua mara ingine tena kuvunwa hii yenye haiva kwa shamba mzuri.
This means labour has to be hired for extended periods, and farmers' incomes have decreased. The latest figures showed coffee production was expected to decline to 40,000 tonnes in 2020, down from 47,000 tonnes 4 years ago.
Well, that's it for Eye on Africa for now. Thanks for joining us. Do so again if you can. Take care.
By giving sovereignty to Panama in 1999 over the canal that they themselves built, the Americans also gave it back the zone, that strip of land either side of the canal that for almost half a century had lived on American time.
This was a small, artificial country led by engineers, designed by engineers.
Despite the departure of the Americans, certain traditions have remained. And memories too, sometimes bitter memories.
Ya uno se va acostumbrando a oír los tiroteos, la bulla, las bombas que a veces comentan.
Watch The Children of the Canal, Panama Revisited on France 24 and France24.com.